Hi there. My name is Chen, and I am so happy to have the opportunity to share what I think are some important lessons that I've learned through my experience at three corporate startups. And I'm hoping that these might be useful for you in your own career as a product manager. And I would love to hear from you for any of the feedback that I've been able to cover today. And maybe you have some other important lessons that might be useful to the broader audience. First, I want to talk a little bit about myself so that you can get to know me. I've worked at three different companies. First one at Intel, then at Google, and at Facebook, and I've spent some time in corporate startups at all of these companies. I have a bachelor's in electrical engineering from Cornell University and an MBA from UC Berkeley Haas School of Business, where I focused on entrepreneurship and venture capital. The products I've worked on have ranged from, at Intel, a remote patient monitoring to a mobile clinical assistant, so healthcare-oriented computing devices. Then the next one at Google was a Android Things and Google Weave, which were platforms for Internet of Things. And then in my second half of Google, I worked on the Daydream VR platform, bringing to market a standalone headset. And then now I work on the Portal family of products at Facebook. This talk is designed for people who are product managers for a large company, and they want to pitch a new product concept that they think might be interesting to drive some growth in an existing business or just something entirely new. Or you might be a product manager of a startup project at a large company and just trying to figure out how might you find better ways to succeed at your role. The big ideas I want to convey to you today are going to be three main points. First one is that it's important to distinguish between who is your customer and who is your user, and that it's really important to be very clear on who your customer is, because sometimes they are different depending on the market and depending on the product space that you're getting into. The second one is focusing on the 10x factor, and the 10x factor is just another way of saying, like, what is that super compelling thing about your product that does better in a proposition that just outdoes the competition or the alternatives that exist. And the third point is about how to cater to your investor, which is your corporate startup executive, because that person is making the decision to fund your product development and to support you in getting it all the way to market. And that person has their own particular needs and their own particular level and appetite for risk taking. And corporate startups are a unique beast in that you have to adapt to the particular environment that they're in. So first, I want to define corporate startups. It seems a little weird because it's like an oxymoron. Because when you think about it, it's a large corporation that's trying to operate like a startup and build a new business. But really what the origin of it is that corporations want to drive growth. They want to keep growing. In their past performance, they were able to find some form of product market fit in a specific industry, and they did one thing really well. They sold tons of the good or sold a lot of the service and made a lot of money in the process. But inevitably, with every market, there gets to a point where the growth tapers off and you see a little bit of an S-curve. And in order to fuel that growth and satisfy the investors and the board of directors, the corporation has to find a new market to get into, has to innovate. Otherwise, they peter out and they fizzle and they don't have much growth. So they have an expectation that they'll find a new market that they can get into and they can drive a significant amount of growth like that magenta curve over there. So the first lesson I want to talk about today will come from a story that I have around my time at Intel when I was working on the Intel Health Guide. It's a chronic disease management solution, a remote patient monitoring solution that helped people stay healthier. First, before we get into the meat and potatoes of it, I want to share a little bit about the context of what was happening in 2006, right around the time that this corporate startup got funded from Mother Intel. In 2006, a lot of money was being spent in healthcare, 1/6 of the US GDP. 14% of the US population was 65 years old or older, and the population as a whole was going to get older by 2040, in fact, up to 20% of the overall population distribution. And moreover, 37% of the US population had at least one chronic disease. These are slowly evolving diseases that if you don't take good care of yourself over time, you get worse and worse, leading to some really bad outcomes. So they could be diabetes, heart disease, or lung diseases. Now, healthcare at the time was just starting to digitize. They were woefully behind all the other industries with going digital. Records were still paper-based, and it was inordinately inefficient. But there were things going in the transformation of healthcare that they were starting to embrace digital technology. So there's a sense that if you could digitize something in healthcare, it was probably good for the industry as a whole. I also want to talk a little bit about Intel's point of view in 2006, because this really frames the way that corporations and the corporate startup views specific opportunities and what they think they can do. So in 2006, Intel's brand was the 5th most valuable consumer-facing brand. If you remember the Intel bong, dum 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 dum, that's a consequence of that brand value. So they thought that they had a tremendous amount of influence with consumers because of that brand. At the same time, they were making a lot of money selling microprocessors into personal computers. They were ranked 50th in the Fortune 500, and so they thought they can continue to grow and do really well. And a lot of the success was fueled by one mantra, is that when data flows, Intel grows, because microprocessors were processing a lot of the digital data that was getting produced. And as long as there was a need for digital computing anywhere, then Intel would stand to be able to benefit and make some money off of it. But what was also notable is that at that point in time, there was a bit of a maturation in the personal computing market. The desktop computer was starting to mature and growth was slowing down. And in the meantime, laptop computing was starting to take off, but Intel saw the signs that if they didn't find new areas of growth, they would certainly see their top line revenue growth as a company start to slow down. So they needed to find something that was disruptive, something that was filled with opportunity, and something that could be really lucrative. So the company looked into telemedicine and telehealth, and it was largely fueled by a personal experience of our chairman of the board, Andy Grove, who was one of the early employees of Intel that helped it grow into the 800-pound gorilla of a semiconductor company that it was. And he had a personal bout with cancer, and through that experience, he realized how hard it was to manage chronic conditions, to be able to connect with your care team, and to have that data immediately available for you and your care team to make timely decisions on how to keep yourself healthier and happier. And so as we looked into the telehealth device landscape, these are the devices that we saw. They were appliances. They did one thing really well, which was take your blood pressure, your other vital signs like your glucose levels, your oxygen level, and your weight, and send that over the internet and send it to your clinician where they could review that data. And you could press a few buttons here and there and respond to simple survey questions. But that was about it. And so we thought there was definitely a room for improvement, because what if we could provide a general purpose or at least a more flexible personal computing platform that would be able to deliver all sorts of healthcare services to the end user, and all they needed was to have a very compelling, very easy to use personal computing device that satisfied that demographic of the 65-year-old and older demo. So Intel's product hypothesis at the time was that patients would be willing to pay a premium or just pay for something, buy something that would help them stay healthier and happier caring for themselves at home. Everyone doesn't want to go into a nursing facility. They want to stay at the comforts of their own home. So we thought that there would be some value that consumers would be willing to pay for if they could stay at home. They could send their vitals directly to their care team. They could respond to survey questions and get personalized care protocols, and that they would be able to see members of their care team through video conferencing when they needed to, instead of jumping into the car and going over to the doctor's office. So it was a very patient-oriented, almost consumer-driven product hypothesis that consumers were empowered to make decisions on what device that they were using to manage their care. But before we get into further, I want to first do a quick little exercise of, like, in this picture, who's the customer? Who's the user? Well, it's pretty obvious that the mother here is the customer. She's opening up her wallet. She's buying the toy for her son. The son is the actual user. So in that case, if you're designing something, in this particular case, you should be, of course, designing the usability for the end user, but you have to appeal to the pocketbook that's being controlled by the customer. And so we had to think about, okay, as we're going through and building out this product concept, who is the customer and who are the end users? Well, the first customer that we thought was going to be the patient, but as we started to engage with others, specifically in the healthcare industry, we started realizing that they're clinicians. So are they the customer? They're definitely the user. They need to be on the opposite end of this device to try to review the health information. So as we explored who our customer was, we started by looking at the end users, okay, the clinician, the patient. But then as we started to develop those relationships with chronic disease management companies, healthcare providers, insurance companies, ministries of health, we started realizing that there were other people within the sphere of influence, like the case manager that's making sure that people were actually going through and getting better, that there were field clinicians that are deploying the devices and occasionally making trips out to see the patients, and the IT director that's responsible for deploying these devices, and then the chief medical informatics officer who's trying to figure out what do you do with all this data and making sure that people are in fact getting the care that they need and that there weren't any adverse conditions to any of the technology that was getting rolled out. But in the end, we found out that one of the main decision makers for whether or not to buy a remote patient monitoring solution was the chief nursing officer. That person had a very different set of needs, in fact, a very broad set of needs, because they had to satisfy all their constituents from the influencers that I just talked to you about. So it took us about 9 to 12 months for us to find the real customer and understand their needs. But the amazing thing was that throughout the 9 to 12 months, our engineers had already started investing in the industrial design, mechanicals, electrical, the software design of that personal health guide, that Intel health guide that I just talked to you about. Like, a bunch of assumptions had to be made, and we ended up building a device that was probably over-engineered for what the real needs of the customer were. So in the end, the final product was a end-to-end clinical solution that addressed the goals and needs of the true customer, the chief nursing officer. It provided web-based tools that clinicians would be able to use to build their care protocols, the questionnaires, and review the data. It would provide data integration with third-party electronic medical records so that you could import, export the data to populate into the electronic medical records and other health information systems. And then that there would be some device provisioning tools to help the IT and the field clinicians to be able to deploy these things. So it was a very different overall value proposition and product definition than we first started. And in truth, some of the actual decisions that we made for the Intel Health Guide device itself were perhaps overboard and drove up the cost of the device too high to be truly competitive. And there was a reason why the other telehealth devices were so simplistic in their design, is because they understood the market, they understood their customers, and they understood the way that the customers were getting paid, the reimbursement models. And so, long story short, on lesson number 1, your user is not always equal to your customer. There's no blanket rule. It's just about understanding the dynamics of the particular industry or market that you're in. And the important thing is that you have to do the due diligence. Do it early, do it as cheaply as possible before you start making really expensive investments in building out a team, building out technology, and then rolling it out. Because you might find that you have the wrong product after you've understood your customer's true needs. Let me shift over to lesson number 2, focusing on the 10x factor. I want to first define what the 10x factor is. This is about a unique value proposition that is subjectively, qualitatively 10x better than the alternative. And here's some concrete examples of what 10x factor might look like. Well, for Amazon, free second-day shipping is their 10x factor. That's the thing that got them really going and catalyzed the user adoption of Amazon as a marketplace for consumers to go buy online and fulfill their consumption habits, and has fueled a lot of Amazon's growth over the last few years. For Apple and the iPod, the main 10x factor was about having 1,000 songs in your pocket when the competition could maybe put about 10 or 25 songs in your MP3 players at the time. And then more recently, Robinhood with free trades. The industry as a whole for personal finance and brokerages charged commissions of $5 to $20 per trade, and Robinhood stepped in and said, we're doing free trades. And that was the single value prop that caused everybody who was a retail investor to want to move over to Robinhood, and that has disrupted the industry. So I want to share a little bit of a story about my time at Google when I worked on the Internet of Things in 2016. And in that time, here's some context that's helpful for framing how Google looked at the opportunity and ultimately the product vision that we had. In 2016, by that point in time, at least 1.8 billion smartphone devices around the world were shipping Google's Android operating system. That's a phenomenal install base and a phenomenal success. And as a result of having that many devices in the field, it meant that there was a robust ecosystem of semiconductor companies, handset manufacturers, component suppliers, software developers that all knew how to build for Android. And so it was an ecosystem that we could, as Google, leverage and apply to another consumer electronic category. And in 2016, Internet of Things was like the new hotness. Every curve that you saw about the Internet of Things showed a up and to the right growth trajectory and pointing out billions and billions of devices and dollars that would be missed if you didn't get yourself into the industry some way, somehow. So it was all the rage. And in 2016, it was also right at the cusp when Google and Amazon were just ready to launch the personal assistants with Alexa and the Google Assistant using voice controls. The first time that the human computer user interaction model would use voice as a modality to control devices. A very exciting time. And so Google's product hypothesis right then and there was that smart home device makers would adopt Google's IoT OS and services because they valued security and keeping their users safe, and that the brands would value updating their devices as often as they could in as easy ways as possible because they could keep the product experience fresh, and that because it's all connected, that they value having device interoperability with other device makers to bring out true smart home automation and make it mainstream and accessible to a broad audience of people. So the product that Google ended up building out was Android Things and Google Weave. Android Things was a secure, updatable, embedded operating system based off of the Android open source, or I should just say based off of Android as a whole. And it was supported by the leading SoC makers from Intel, Marvell, NXP. And you could buy these modules and you could develop a prototype on them and then work with these SoC makers to get components and then commercialize a product in very simple, quick time. The other half of this platform was the Google Weave platform. It was a device communications protocol that would enable devices to communicate with Google and to communicate with one another. So light bulb to light bulb, security system to the alarm, to the smoke detectors, to light bulbs, you name it. To have schemas that were well defined and that ultimately Google would be able to serve as a mediator with a personal assistant. So we thought that the customers, which would be like the device maker brands from consumer electronics companies, would value that value proposition and value the product. But the reality of the smart home IoT market was that, one, it's a very commoditized and fragmented market. Lots of brands, they've been in the market for a while, everyone's fighting for a profit margin, and as a result, prices are sliding, and they're looking for ways to innovate, to drive pricing to go back up so they can make more money. And so as a consequence, they're looking for ways to sell more unit volume or to sell more features to raise the price of a particular model. And the truth of the matter is that in this consumer electronics market, the dynamic is that once you've sold the product, you have no more relationship, really. The device maker has very little incentive to actually support the product on an ongoing basis because any ongoing support will result in an erosion or eating away at the profits. So in the PC industry and in consumer electronics, what has long been a problem that is recognized is as soon as a customer makes a phone call to a customer support operator, the profit margin on that device is gone. That is the well-established fact of this industry. It's very cutthroat. And so ongoing support was just something that not many device makers really wanted to do. So the 10X factor was really all about voice controls. When I went around and visited many of these consumer electronics manufacturers, and I pitched them this new operating system that would be so much more secure and updatable, and this interoperability communication protocol. They always say, oh, that's really great, thanks for telling me that, but really, how does that connect to Google? I already have a cloud service, I already have an operating system, I'm pretty happy, it's not broken, so how can I just use it to connect to Google? That was the 10x factor. Everyone just wanted to be able to take advantage of the product innovation with voice controls from Google Assistant, and also a lot of the marketing that Google was investing to raise awareness of the Google Assistant. And so it became very clear that all these customers wanted to do was to figure out how to integrate their existing cloud service to Google so that you could do voice controls for their device. So the final product that actually ended up happening based off of the realization of the 10x factor was to build a cloud-to-cloud integration with a Google Assistant that these device makers could just simply interface to and then be able to communicate with the assistant. So Google built out the Actions on Google developer platform. In full disclosure, not my product, but it was tremendously successful in bringing thousands of IoT device makers on board to fulfill this vision of the Google Assistant controlling the smart home. So in summary, lesson number 2, it's about finding out what your product's 10x factor really is as quickly and as cheaply as possible, knowing full well that you've already established who your customer is. Because the faster that you can figure it out, the more that you're going to be able to test your product hypothesis and narrow down to what really is the feature or the set of features that really compel your customer to switch from their alternative and adopt your product. Finally, to lesson 3, catering to your investor. So at a corporate startup, your investor is the exec that is running the show. And you only have one investor. You can't really shop him or her around. So let's first start by understanding the corporate exec that is serving in this role. That is a person. This person has had a really great track record of making a lot of money for the company, was probably a hot shot who worked on the core business, had a tremendous amount of experience in building an organization, leading and making hard decisions around that core business to make the money and to, as a result of that, build credibility with the CEO. And the CEO has entrusted this person to run this new startup business and to find a way to grow it into, yet again, a large cash cow. The expectations for this corporate startup exec is exactly like what I showed you earlier. It is about trying to find that leader or the leader is responsible for driving that magenta curve. These are very high expectations because if you think about, for example, in a case like Intel with its, like for example, the business unit I was working in was running a run rate of $38 billion every single year. And it was trying to invest in a startup that would have that sort of growth expectation. Like even if you were any regular startup in your first or second year, if you were able to get double-digit $1 million or even $100 million, those would be pretty phenomenal numbers, right? Any startup entrepreneur would be thrilled to have that sort of growth. But when you think about the relative comparison of tens of millions or 100 million to $38 billion, it's like a rounding error. So the types of investments that you're going to look as a startup exec or a corp startup exec are going to be about how can you find which opportunity gives you the best path and the best ROI to get to that type of growth trajectory. It's a very high set of expectations. So let's say that you as the product manager have come up with this beautiful vision. You have figured out what the feature looks like, what the problem is that you want to go solve, who your customer is, what your 10x factor is, and what are the concrete product features and roadmap that you want to go build to fulfill this vision. How do you get it funded by your leader? Well, the challenge is that you're going to have to create a pitch that allows your leader to raise the stakes in an unfamiliar environment And there's going to be a lot of hesitation because there's a lot of uncertainty that that person has because they don't understand the dynamics of the market. They don't understand what are the risks and what are the challenges along the way. So it is really important for you to help bridge the gap. Because, for example, if the startup exec is like Maverick from Top Gun, sorry, I'm an 80s kid, so that's a reference that might go over your head for some of you. He's an Air Force pilot, okay? I might trust him to fly a commercial airliner that I would sit on, okay? The stakes are higher, but he knows flying, it's probably more or less the same. If he goes over to a new unfamiliar territory, like let's say he turns out to be like an amateur chef and he wants to prepare meals for me, okay, I might be all right. The stakes are low, so what's the worst that could happen? But would I trust Maverick to do surgery in an operating theater on me? Probably not. Stakes are really high, unfamiliar, so he might not even be willing to make the decisions to do certain things. So imagine that sort of up and to the right conundrum that this startup leader has. Making big commitments, whether it be PR, hiring, budget, and in an unfamiliar domain, it's really going to be hard. So what ends up happening is that there's a lot of analysis by paralysis, because your leader is going to keep asking for more data, more insight, trying to reduce the amount of uncertainty and risk so that way it's manageable for her or him to make that decision. So what's the right way of going about it? It's about pitching your investor in this sort of framework. Okay, this is a framework that's pretty rough, high level. You can find more on my LinkedIn page where I've written an article about what I think are some of the key questions to ask to write this pitch even more. But in short, it's about defining the vision. What's the problem that you're solving for? What's the solution? Who's the customer? Then defining the concrete goals. These are the business outcomes that you are aspiring or that you will try to address and solve for in years 1, 2, and 3. And it's really important to bring it to the business impact that your leader can understand and connect it back to the overall corporate mission and goals and their own success metrics. Strategy, it's about outlining what are the big bets, both internal and external, that you need to make. And what are the things that you're going to do if certain assumptions change that allow you or that force you to revise the strategy a little bit. Tactics are the very concrete tasks that you need to do in order to support each one of these bets. Now, metrics. You got to measure how well you're progressing along your execution of your strategy. So what are the things that are measurable, quantifiable, that you can use to demonstrate progress? And it's using these metrics to show the gradual progress when you review in these checkpoints with your leaders, that they understand you are making progress and that they're willing to take that next level of investment and risk with you. And then, of course, you need to spell out the resources and the budget that will be required of who do you need to hire, what budget do you need to be able to make that next level of investment to test certain assumptions. And then also what's really important is about identifying the risks that you expect, either external or internal risks, and figuring out the severity, the likelihood of the impact onto your actual strategy and the tactics that you're going to take. Because the last thing that the exec wants to have is egg in their face. It's a very high stakes environment. They have to report back to their CEO how they're spending the money. And so they want to make sure that they're allowing the company to protect its brand, protect its image, and to, of course, protect its financial resources. So if at first you don't succeed, and I've been in through so many of these pitches where it's just iterative, back and forth, fetch me another rock. And what you'll need to do is you need to break it down as small terms. It's just like using the lean startup model is about build, measure, learn. Whether it be building the product or building the pitch, you want to be able to adopt an iterative process. And it will feel like you're just banging your head against the wall time and time and time again because you just can't keep getting the progress that you want. Like you just wish you could get a blank check. But the reality is that this is actually good for you. And the reason why is that by getting feedback on the key tipping points of what really matters to your leader in the decision-making process, it's going to help refine the essence of your pitch, the essence of the product's value proposition, your strategy, your execution plan. It will make your product better and it will make you better. If you have a great leader, that leader is going to bring out the best of you and making sure that your likelihood of success will only continue to increase. But on a personal and more candid note, there will be times that you might find yourself in a position with a leader who can't make the decision, and you just keep spinning your wheels. And no matter how far you iterate, you just can't seem to get that person to see your vision, to take the risk with you, to fund your program. The truth of the matter, if all else fails after many, many rounds of attempt, it might be time to move on. Move on with a different product vision, or maybe your vision is real, but it's just not the right organization to invest in it, and you might want to actually go look elsewhere outside the company, or look for different investors that will be really willing to fund your product opportunity. You have to have that type of conviction, though, in order to pull it off. So thank you for hanging in there with me for the last 30 minutes. So in summary, the big idea is, 1, really understand who your customer and your users are, and pay attention to the customer's needs, because oftentimes that's going to be the tipping point to help your product be successful. Secondly is, once you've identified the product opportunity space, zone in on that 10x factor. That's going to be the most valuable piece of information and as an opportunity for your product to shine and drive a difference in behavior with your customer. And then once you've got your product opportunity and vision, you have to understand and cater to your audience, which is the corporate startup executive. What are their motivators? What are their objections? What are they afraid of? What are the risks that they need to be aware of? And how are you going to best mitigate all of their concerns? And it will be an iterative process. So I want to thank you for hanging there with me, and I appreciate all the open questions and feedback and comments. Maybe you are also a product manager at a corporate startup and you have a different set of experiences that you would like to share. I would love to hear about it. Please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter to keep the conversation going. Thank you, and best of luck in your next product endeavor.